And James, I can no longer see the number of participants in the Q&A.
Great. So we have people joining in, so they'll be able to hear us now. We have about 35 or so that have joined. And it's still growing, so I don't know if you want to give it another minute.
Oh, I see it now. Okay, there we go. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. We're just waiting 1 minute just to let a few more people in. Nous sommes prêts, Lingette.
Thank you. So hello and welcome everyone. Bonjour et bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Thank you for joining us for today's online webinar, Climate, Cities and Biodiversity. Merci de vous joindre à nous pour ce webinaire en ligne intitulé Climat, Ville et Biodiversité. I'm Najat Gefraz, the Quebec Center for Biodiversity Science Manager, and we are pleased to host this event in collaboration with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And without further delay, I'm pleased to hand it over to our session moderator, Mark, who will guide us throughout today's discussion. Thank you all.
Merci, Najat. Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Mark Johnson et je suis un professeur de biologie à l'Université de Toronto. My name is Mark Johnson. I'm a professor of biology at University of Toronto, Mississauga, a Canada Research Chair for Urban Environmental Science, and the Vice President of the Canadian Society of Ecology and Evolution. It's wonderful to be here with you in this Earth Day week, the last webinar. I will be co-hosting, helped by Carly Zeter, and moderating today's webinar and speakers. So the whole week has been referred to as under the theme of connecting people, planet, and prosperity. And today we're going to focus on climate, cities, and biodiversity. Climat, ville et biodiversité. We have a few preliminary remarks, and we'll give you some instructions for how we'll be doing this, and then we'll get into I'll tell you more about what you'll be seeing and how you can interact with everyone. Before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Treaty 13A territory. I'm in Mississauga, the traditional land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, who have been in this area for thousands of years. And many people from the Mississaugas of the Credit are still here, and Indigenous people from all over North America call where I am home. At the same time, many of our speakers are coming from Montreal and around the Montreal area, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin people have lived on this land for thousands of years, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to present in this territory and have responsibility together in thinking about Earth Day and how we can all be stewards of the land, whether you are Indigenous and have been here for thousands of years or whether you have come more recently. Right now, I'd like to introduce you to Carly Zeter, Associate Professor at University of Concordia, who's going to help me with some of the opening remarks. Carly.
OK, merci Marc et bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vais juste répéter encore en français. Nous souhaitons reconnaître que la terre sur laquelle nous sommes réunis est le territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin Anishinaabe. Les peuples algonquins vivent sur ce territoire depuis des millénaires. Nous sommes reconnaissants d'avoir l'opportunité d'être présents sur ce territoire aujourd'hui. Merci.
Merci, Carly. So some instructions to help you along in this webinar so that you can participate more smoothly and more interactively. Just a few things. If you are having problems with your audio, check your audio settings to be sure that the Zoom has access to your speakers or your headphones. If you're having problems with that, you can put a little remark in the chat Only the panelists will see this remark. So if you can't hear us or if you can't see the slides, please let us know and we'll try to resolve the problem as best we can. We would strongly encourage you to ask questions as we go along. We won't answer them as we go along. We'll save all of the answers to the end, but it's much easier to think of the questions and to ask them as you're seeing things. And it'll also make for a much more interesting and lively discussion at the end. If you are hearing impaired, please know that you can turn on the closed captionings in the Zoom toolbar to see what is being said. And if you are not an English speaker, but a French speaker, then there will be a translation, both French and English, that will be available after this webinar so that you can understand the full discussion that's happening, because people will be speaking and asking their questions in the language that they're most comfortable with. And I'd encourage you to ask the questions and to speak in either French or English. Carly.
OK. Oui, juste une petite mot sur la langue. Cet événement est co-organisé par le CSPQ, le Centre de la science de biodiversité du Québec. Nous utiliserons donc les deux langues, anglaise et français. Aujourd'hui, nous aurons des panélistes en anglais et en français et des panélistes comme moi qui parlent franglais. Mais dans quelques jours, vous recevrez également un lien vers la présentation avec la possibilité d'ajouter le sous-titre dans les deux langues. OK, je vais simplement répéter les instructions en français. Si vous avez des problèmes avec le son, c'est un peu drôle puisque vous ne m'entendez probablement pas, mais si vous avez des problèmes avec le son, vérifiez les paramètres audio pour vous assurer que Zoom a accès à vos haute-parleurs ou à vos écouteurs aussi. Seuls les panélistes verront les messages du chat, donc veuillez l'utiliser en cas de problème technique. Par exemple, si vous ne voyez pas la présentation ou si vous avez des problèmes audio. Et aussi pour les questions, il y a une boîte par Zoom, Q&A, peut-être pour poser des questions aux présentateurs. Écrivez les questions à n'importe quel moment et nous y répondons à la fin. C'est beaucoup plus intéressant pour tous si nous avons des questions à répondre. Alors, ne soyez pas timide. Posez des questions, s'il vous plaît. Les questions peuvent être rédigées en anglais ou en français. Tout c'est bon. Aussi, si vous préférez les sous-titres, vous pouvez utiliser, il y a un petit bouton en Zoom pour pour les sous-titres. OK, ça va.
Merci. I'd like to just take a moment to thank the partners that made this possible, particularly the Canadian Wildlife Federation that has been kind of sponsoring the whole webinar series, and today is co-sponsored with the Quebec Centre for Biodiversity of Science. Carly.
OK, un grand merci à tous les partenaires de cet événement, le CFPQ et la Fédération canadienne de la faune, mais aussi beaucoup d'autres partenaires. Et pour moi, cette liste montre clairement que la ville, la biodiversité et le climat sont des questions transversales. Donc, merci à tous nos partenaires.
Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, the theme today is climate, cities, and biodiversity. And what I've asked each of today's speakers to try and address is clearly identify a problem related to this theme, and then offer some clear solutions. And we'd love to hear what you think of these solutions, or maybe you have some of your own solutions for some of these problems. And so that's the challenge that everyone's been faced with. And so that's what you're going to be hearing. Each person is going to speak for about 10 minutes, sharing some slides, the problems as they see them, the solutions as they see them. I'll introduce each person, then they'll have 10 minutes, and then you will have a chance to ask questions at the end. So I am getting to go first. As I said, my name, if you did not catch it at the beginning, is Mark Johnson. Je m'appelle Mark Johnson. Je suis un professeur de biologie à l'Université de Toronto. And the problem that I'd like to address and talk about, of course, is a very large one. One that we're all familiar with. We are living in a fundamentally different time on this earth. Many people have referred to this time as a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, in which humans are now having a decisive influence on the state, dynamics, and future of our planet. I'd like to argue that much of this, most of this, in fact, is being driven by what is happening in cities around the world. Urban areas today cover just 0.5% of the Earth's land surface. That may not seem like a lot. And you may say, well, how can it be so important to climate change and biodiversity, given that it only covers such a fraction? Well, it is the fastest growing ecosystem on Earth. And most humans live in cities, like this photo I took in Tokyo, Japan. Here in Canada, 82% of all Canadians live in some type of urban development. This is where most of us live. And when you crunch the numbers, it also turns out that most of the emissions that are happening in terms of carbon dioxide and other pollutants are based in cities. These effects of cities are not local. This is driving global climate change, and the pollution that's being emitted and the changing of the chemistry of the air we breathe, of the soil that plants grow in, and of the oceans and fresh water where organisms live, is altering biodiversity on Earth, as well as the non-native species like these mute swans that we're bringing in here as well. Not to mention all of the land changes that we're doing, both locally, but also at a distance. So I mentioned 2/3 of all emissions are coming from cities. Well, over 2/3, roughly 3/4 of all resources being extracted on Earth are to drive what's happening in cities. And this is a very large problem. So I'd like to offer two solutions. These are not complete solutions, I recognize, but I think they are part of the puzzle to achieving a healthier and more sustainable society for humans on Earth. The first solution I'd like to propose is that we engage youth, engager les jeunes. Particularly, it's important that we engage adults, of course, but I think we really need to engage youth in a big way and connect kids with nature, where we get them outside, understanding nature, appreciating nature, and really start to learn the importance of protecting nature. I think there's a lot of ways to do this. The way that we've tried to do this, myself, my wife, and other people that we're engaging with, is locally we've created a junior naturalist program where we take kids and we bring them outside to experience hands-on what it's like to, hold an insect or clean up the environment and picking garbage, and teaching them to be young naturalists and young scientists. I think this is something, although we've done this locally, I think this is something that really needs to happen coast to coast to coast. And why I think this is important is because if you think about these young naturalist clubs, this provides certainly increases the cognitive growth of young people. It is good physically for them, emotionally, socially, and they also learn to be stewards of the earth. These are the people that in 2050, in 2070, that are going to be the adults that inherit the decisions that we are making now. They are going to be the decision makers at that time. And if we instill these values in them now, perhaps this will help us to have an environment that is healthier for everyone. Now, I mentioned this junior naturalist program not to toot our own horns of something that we're doing, but more as a plea to you, in that this is something that we really need many people to be doing locally. If we want to do this coast to coast to coast, we need people trying to connect kids with nature in every town and city across this country as much as possible. And I know this can be intimidating, so we've actually made a little guide to help you, the development and facilitation of Junior Naturalist Club programs that takes you from the beginning to the end on how you can actually implement this. So you can contact me. If you just look up Mark Johnson, U Toronto, you'll be able to find my email address, and I'm happy to send this to you. And we'd be excited for other people to start growing these types of programs. So that's the first solution I'd like to offer. The second solution I'd like to offer is not so much connecting people with nature, but instead transforming the cities that we live in. Specifically trying to transform cities for conservation and our own well-being. And I think to do this, we can follow 4 relatively simple steps in concept, although there can be larger challenges when trying to implement them. But I think there are case examples that I don't have time to go into now, but maybe through questions that I think serve as nice models. The first step is I think we have to preserve as much of the existing natural spaces as possible when we're building these cities. And you know, many cities are long established. If you're in Montreal or Quebec, been there for hundreds of years. We have to restore degraded communities and ecosystems within those cities as best we can. So if we think about a city like this one in gray, that's maybe bordering some watercourse like the St. Lawrence Seaway or Lake Ontario, like myself here, as those cities naturally grow, we can preserve as much of that space as possible. So making sure that there are natural areas for organisms that coexist in these cities, but also for us to enjoy. And then these kind of multicolored parks in the center that get degraded, as shown by these different colors here, make sure that we're restoring them as best we can into healthier ecosystems. Now, after we preserve and restore, I think it's important that we try to create new natural spaces whenever possible and connect these natural spaces as much as we can. So if we look at, you know, this city that we are talking about, if we can carve out new areas for wildlife and plants and ecosystems, maybe by creating new habitats, which is quite possible, and then connecting them to make sure that these organisms can sustain themselves and reestablish if they go locally extinct. In preserving, restoring, creating, and connecting these natural areas, this will promote conservation of native populations, communities, and ecosystems, and there is mounting evidence that there are benefits for human well-being as well. Everything from your mental health to your physical health. There are numerous benefits, which I'm happy to discuss. So if you have any questions about this or comments, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we will make sure that we get them addressed at the end. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I was able to get in under time, so that's great. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Laura Jean-Raymond Léonard, who is a PhD student at Université de Québec à Montréal. And Laura will be telling us about urban soil biodiversity. Laura, over to you.
Yes. Oh, I jumped in right. Yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm Laura. So, bonjour, je vais vous parler en français. Je vais parler d'un aspect de la biodiversité des villes qu'on parle peu souvent, et c'est la biodiversité des sols. Donc, on plonge. La biodiversité des sols représente plus de 50% des espèces de toute la Terre, donc c'est vraiment immense. Ça va des vers de terre qui vont créer des tunnels et diminuer la compaction des sols, jusqu'aux décomposeurs, les gros mille-pattes, jusqu'aux petits collemboles. Donc, c'est vraiment une diversité qui est immense et très riche. Et cette diversité-là a un effet sur la fonctionnalité des écosystèmes. Alors, comme on peut voir, il y a vraiment une corrélation positive. Plus on a d'espèces dans notre sol, et ça, cette corrélation, elle a été prouvée aussi en milieu urbain, plus on a une biodiversité, plus qu'on a d'espèces dans nos sols, plus notre fonctionnalité va être performante. Qu'est-ce que je veux dire par là? Plus on va avoir des fonctions qui vont... plus on va avoir de fonctions, dans le fond. Donc, on va réduire les pathogènes des plantes, augmenter le recyclage des nutriments. Donc, il y a plein de fonctions comme ça qui sont bonnes pour, par exemple, la croissance des plantes. Mais on a aussi récemment démontré que la biodiversité des sols peut avoir un impact sur notre santé humaine à nous. Ça peut moduler notre microbiome, diminuer nos allergies, diminuer notre asthme. Donc, on a tout intérêt à promouvoir ce pan méconnu de la biodiversité. Toutefois, voici mon problème, tel que Marc me l'a demandé. La biodiversité des sols est toujours peu considérée, pour ne pas dire pas considérée, dans tout ce qui est nos décisions d'aménagement de nos espaces verts. Puis ça, c'est principalement parce qu'on ne sait pas. qu'est-ce qui vit dans nos sols. C'est difficile de faire une mesure pour, comment dire, favoriser quelque chose quand on ne sait pas c'est quoi l'état des choses en premier. Et on ne sait pas non plus comment on peut l'influencer, cette biodiversité-là. La biodiversité des sols, c'est quelque chose qui est beaucoup étudié en milieu forestier, en milieu agricole, mais quand on rentre dans nos villes, on sait très peu. Donc, je vais vous présenter un peu comment on pourrait pallier à ça via un exemple à l'échelle locale. Donc, c'est le cas de la gestion différenciée des pelouses. Donc, peut-être que vous voyez ça, vous, dans vos écosystèmes urbains. De plus en plus, on le voit, on a des zones non tondues qui vont cohabiter avec des zones tondues dans nos espaces verts. Ça a pour but d'augmenter la résilience de ces écosystèmes-là au changement climatique parce qu'on le sait, dès qu'il fait chaud, dès qu'il fait sec, nos pelouses deviennent brunes. Elles ne sont pas capables d'être résilientes à ça. Et ça nous permet d'augmenter aussi la biodiversité. Donc, il y a des données qui prouvent qu'on a plus de papillons, plus d'abeilles. Donc, c'est vraiment axé sur les pollinisateurs, les données qu'on a. Mais quand on pense au sol, on ne sait pas qu'est-ce qui se passe. Donc, il faut vraiment générer des données pour essayer de comprendre comment la tonte des pelouses va affecter la biodiversité des sols, mais aussi la fonctionnalité des sols. Et là, je vais vous présenter un peu une initiative locale qui s'est faite ici à Montréal, qui nous a permis d'adresser ces questions-là. Donc, on a fait une étude très, très locale à l'intérieur d'un seul quartier à Montréal, dans 7 parcs et 3 sections du Jardin botanique de Montréal, où on comparait des zones tondues à des zones non tondues depuis peu. Hein? Donc, ça restait des zones qui n'étaient pas trop hautes, beaucoup de pissenlits. À l'échelle cartographique ça ressemblait à ça. Donc, on comparait des zones non tondues et tondues. Et quand je dis non tondues, il y avait quand même quand je dis non tondues, il y avait quand même une tonte à l'automne pour empêcher les espèces ligneuses de s'installer. On avait aussi des zones qui étaient non tondues depuis plus longtemps. Donc, on a été capable d'explorer les effets à court, moyen et long terme d'une réduction de tonte. Donc, on a mis des pièges comme ça qui nous permettent de collecter les petits invertébrés qui tombent dedans. Et alentour de chacun de nos pièges qu'on a posés dans les parcs, on en avait 112, on a collecté une batterie de mesures, c'est-à-dire les nutriments dans le sol, la compaction des sols, la température du sol, bref, plein de mesures. Puis, on a essayé de mettre en relation tout ça ensemble pour mieux comprendre. Donc, la première étape, il faut mieux documenter la biodiversité des sols. Et ça prend beaucoup de temps au microscope, comme vous pouvez le voir ici. Donc, voici un peu ce qu'on a eu comme résultat. Juste dans Rosemont, on a trouvé plus de 128 000 organismes dans notre petite batterie d'échantillons, puis 113 espèces, qui est quand même assez grand, assez immense. Même les araignées, là, je pense qu'on avait à peu près 500 individus, puis on avait une trentaine d'espèces. C'est quand même assez impressionnant. Ce qu'on a fait après, c'est qu'on a créé des indices qui regroupaient tous ces taxons-là en un indice. Parce que c'est bien beau de savoir qu'on va avoir un effet sur les fourmis. Ce qu'on veut savoir, c'est l'idée globale. Donc, on a créé des indices pour notre multi-abondance, donc le nombre d'individus, puis notre richesse, notre nombre d'espèces, qui prenaient tout ça en compte. Donc, quand on est à 1, c'est très fort, et 0, c'est très faible. On a eu, je ne vais pas m'attarder là-dessus, mais juste pour vous dire qu'on a eu des surprises dans nos échantillons. Par exemple, le colembole Entomobria unostrigata, une nouvelle mention pour le Québec et le Canada, mais ce n'est pas le seul. On a eu 10 nouvelles espèces de colembole pour le Canada, juste en regardant dans quelques parcs de Rosemont. À quel point pour vous dire que c'est une biodiversité qu'on ne connaît pas. On est quand même la 2e métropole la plus grosse du Canada, mais on va dehors et on trouve des nouvelles espèces pour le pays. Donc, ça ici, c'est peut-être un tableau compliqué, mais je veux juste que vous vous attardiez là-dessus. Dans le fond, c'est nos corrélations entre nos différentes fonctions de l'écosystème et nos différents compartiments de la biodiversité. Quand c'est bleu avec des étoiles, on a une corrélation positive, et quand c'est rouge avec des étoiles, une corrélation négative. Et ce qu'on voit, c'est que plus on a une multidiversité, moins nos sols sont compactés, et plus on est actif dans le recyclage des nutriments, et plus qu'on a d'azote dans nos sols. Tous des bonnes choses pour la croissance des plantes. Donc, on a intérêt à promouvoir cette biodiversité-là. Elle a des effets sur les écosystèmes. J'arrive à la 2e étape, qui était d'approfondir comment la gestion des pelouses influençait les sols. Donc, on a vu que quand on réduisait la tonte, ici, c'est les barres vertes, on était capable de vraiment augmenter la multidiversité des sols de plus de 70 %, ce qui est quand même assez immense. Mais seulement dans les parcs. On n'a pas vu d'effet au jardin botanique. Mais quand on s'attarde plus précisément, voyez-vous la ligne orange, on voit que la barre brune, qui était les zones tondues, bien, la biodiversité, elle était déjà élevée dans ces zones-là. Hein? Le jardin botanique, il y a moins de perturbations, les gens ils marchent dans les sentiers, on a une grande richesse végétale, donc ça se peut que notre biodiversité elle était plus grande. Et ça démontre que cette mesure, la gestion différenciée des pelouses, elle est utile quand les sols sont perturbés et non pas quand les sols vont déjà bien. Quand on regardait dans le temps, ici, quand on voit une icône, c'est qu'on a un effet positif. Donc, après 2 ans, à l'intérieur de 2 ans, quand on a réduit la tonte, on a vu un effet positif sur notre multidiversité. Donc, on avait plus d'espèces en général, puis on avait plus de carabes aussi. Sauf que l'effet de la multidiversité, comme vous le voyez, c'est persisté dans le temps. On voyait toujours un effet positif 6 à 11 ans après la réduction de tonte. Toutefois, l'effet pour les taxons différait selon le temps. Fait que quand on voit au début les carabes, c'était un effet récent, puis après ça, les populations y redescendaient. Alors que pour les araignées, ça a pris plus de temps avant d'avoir un effet positif. Donc oui, on voit un effet rapide et persistant pour l'ensemble de nos espèces, mais il faut aussi maintenir notre réduction de tonte dans le temps parce que certains taxons, certains groupes, que ça va leur prendre du temps avant de bénéficier de ce changement d'écosystème-là. Donc, on n'a pas seulement eu plus d'espèces, on a aussi eu des espèces différentes. On avait 77 espèces qui étaient partagées entre nos zones tondues et non tondues, mais on a rajouté 32 espèces dans nos zones non tondues. Donc, on augmentait de 30 là, notre nombre d'espèces. Donc, c'est encore une fois beaucoup. C'est vraiment une mesure qui est efficace pour augmenter notre biodiversité. Et juste pour vous dire encore, tantôt, on a montré le lien entre le fonctionnement de l'écosystème et la biodiversité. Donc, si on augmente notre biodiversité, on augmente le fonctionnement de l'écosystème. D'ailleurs, juste quelques rapides graphiques juste pour vous montrer l'effet sur l'écosystème. On a montré une tendance des sols à être moins chauds. Plus la végétation elle est grande, hein, d'ailleurs. Donc, on va avoir des sols qui vont être moins chauds, 2,4 degrés Celsius quand même. Là, c'est beaucoup après 6 ans de sols moins chauds. Et ça, c'est important parce que quand nos sols sont chauds, toute notre biodiversité, elle est moins active. Soit qu'elle va plus profondément dans le sol se cacher, soit qu'elle va sécher. Et donc, si on veut que notre biodiversité performe dans notre écosystème, eh bien, d'avoir une genre de zone tampon qui nous permet de faire un buffer contre les fluctuations de température, c'est essentiel. Et finalement, on a vu des effets clairs sur la compaction du sol. Donc, dans les parcs, on a vu un effet après 6 ans. Hein, notre compaction était grandement diminuée. Puis dans le jardin botanique, on a un effet rapide. Là. À l'intérieur de 2 ans, on avait vraiment une diminution de la compaction. Puis dans le fond, c'est qu'il y a un contexte de pétinement qui est différent. Ça nous démontre que oui, ça peut diminuer la compaction, mais que si on a beaucoup de gens qui marchent dans notre milieu, ça peut prendre plus de temps avant de voir l'effet. Je voulais juste vous dire aussi que c'est important qu'on a observé aussi des variations dans la... Ah, ça c'est moi, oui, OK. Des variations dans la compaction à travers les années. Et ça nous montre juste encore une fois que oui, c'est ça. En fait, ce que je voulais dire, c'est que le climat influence aussi la compaction. Donc, on a intérêt aussi à diminuer notre compaction parce que ça va encore faire une fois un tampon contre les fluctuations du climat. Donc, mes messages clés, c'est oui, on a une bonne biodiversité dans les sols. Elle va nous aider pour le fonctionnement de l'écosystème. La réduction de tonte a eu des effets rapides et persistants sur la diversité des sols. On a diminué la compaction, augmenté le recyclage des nutriments. C'était efficace quand les sols étaient perturbés, hein, mais pas au jardin botanique, donc bien dans les parcs ou les terre-pleins. Et ça peut nous aider à pallier aux fluctuations liées au changement climatique. Donc, quand je reviens à mon problème, hein, on ne savait pas c'était quand on adresse ces problèmes-là, on est capable de mieux considérer la biodiversité des sols, puis vraiment de la considérer dans la gestion des pelouses. Donc, il faut documenter, il faut être curieux sur les sols. Donc, voilà. Merci.
Parfait, merci beaucoup, Laura. Très bien. So, as a reminder, please put your questions in the chat for Laura and other panelists as we talk, as you think about things, as you want to offer some ideas. Next up, I'd like to introduce James Paget, who is a species at risk specialist with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and he's going to be telling us about a project that he's been working on. James, take it. And don't forget to unmute.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. Zoom presentation just hid my Zoom functions there for a second. Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to be talking about the last two themes here in this climate, cities, and biodiversity. And spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about the City Nature Challenge that's started today. So in framing this in the idea of a problem or an opportunity, in a sense, a challenge, is this idea of nature deficit. So I'm sure people have heard about the idea of nature deficit disorder, but we're living in a very urbanized areas, as Mark explained. Majority of people live in cities. Technology is competing for our attention, which is limiting our access and ability to connect with nature and appreciate nature, and essentially having great experiences like we see here. But despite it being nearly impossible to avoid technology that's collecting information and people leaving a footprint nearly every square kilometer of the country, we actually have very limited information on the species that we share our cities with. But as I say, this actually can be part of a solution. So we think about there's a nature deficit, but also maybe a data deficit. And enter here the community scientist. There are people across the globe in many of our communities. There's a wealth of biodiversity right outside our doors in cities and rural areas alike. And technology, if used consciously, can really be a valuable tool to connect with nature, but also to provide or to gather information on the species that we're seeing. And so engaging people in recording wildlife not only benefits our understanding of biodiversity, but it also gives people a reason to stop, to observe, to notice there's something living there, and we can take a photo of it and helps provide information on the species that we share our planet with. iNaturalist is a tool that is designed to do this in an easy way to record and share wildlife. It also provides the ability to identify the species that we're looking at. And I want to emphasize that is, to me, a very important factor. So, you know, being able to identify something, I know it's not everybody's a species expert and that we need to put a name on everything, but hear me out on this little experiment here. If you have a look at the photo, think about what your impression is of this. You know, this is roadside ditch. There's a few wildflowers in that. Now I want you to try here and see how many different species you can see in this image. Now you don't have to know what species they are. Just notice that there's things that are different from each other, right? You don't have to identify them, but I'm going to do that for a little bit. And this is just from the photo. So my idea is not perfect from being able to see in the photo, but these are different species that I've noticed just by looking at this picture. And as we put names to the things in this photo, what does your attitude towards this area feel like now? You know, we realize that it's more than just a bunch of grasses and flowers and weeds potentially to some people. And I would argue that there is an emotional connection to naming something. There's a reason farmers don't name their cattle, right? There's a difference between eating Betsy for supper or having a hamburger. And I would argue it's the same when you think about plants or wildlife on an area. There's more likelihood to have this emotional attachment to things that we name and we know that's there than mowing it straight over if we don't have this kind of connection to it. And there's a value in understanding that it's not just a bunch of plants on the roadside. Now, beyond the intrinsic value, there's a value of to conservation collectively in these observations. And iNaturalist is a good example of this. There are others, but I'm just talking about iNaturalist right now, where there's the community, there's a value in what the community scientists find, name, and upload to conservation, that data that can then be shared for conservation use. Here in Canada, we have iNaturalist Canada, but this is a global network across the world with more than 22 countries having their own version translated into their local languages. And there's a wealth of data and information in this. I'm just want to show the growth in Canada here. This is year one. So this year currently is our 10th year anniversary of launching iNaturalist in Canada. What you're seeing now is a map of the observations in year one, where we had about 30,000 observations in iNaturalist. This heat map, so these orange and red darker areas show like a concentrations of observations. So bear in mind about this connection piece, each one of these represents a bunch of observations, not just one in these red and orange squares. But this is a moment in time where someone has stopped, has recorded something, and connected at that moment in time with a species that exists there. So this is the growth over the years as we filled data gaps around the country to 2025. This is the end of 2024, actually. We have now 17 million observations, but also 245,000 people in Canada have contributed. So that's a lot of engagement and people that are now connecting with nature in a meaningful way, that they're knowing they're contributing something that's valuable to conservation. And I just want to give one example on how that's valuable. There's many, but when we look at the map on our left here is the concentration of species at risk in Canada. So where more species are found, more species, number of species. So this is richness. Is the darker red areas. It coincides pretty well to the darker red areas of the iNaturalist observations. So all that to say is we have a lot of people on the ground recording things where there also are a lot of species at risk occurring. And coincidentally, we have a species at risk project in iNaturalist, and this has gathered all species at risk observations that people have recorded. We have almost 340,000 observations covering 586 species. There are about 800 species, a little over 800 species that are assessed at risk by the Committee on the Endangered Wildlife, Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. So we've got almost all of them that people have recorded at some point in Canada. But it's not just for scientists. So this is the same map that I showed at the beginning when I talked about how where people live in cities. These are the observations in iNaturalist in the same location. This is a very urban area, and there's still a lot of opportunity to connect with nature. And not only for the people that are observing and taking a minute to observe the wildlife, but each point is clickable. People can use this to look around and see what exists in their city. If you think you live in an urban area and there's no wildlife around, have a look at iNaturalist and you'll see there's a ton of different species that are just literally outside your doorstep. And now when we look about recording and contributing to iNaturalist, I want to emphasize people don't need to be experts. There's a super simple to use app, guides you through how to make an observation. There's a website which allows you to drag and drop photos, and both of which incorporate image recognition software to help you identify what that species is. And on top of that, there's a whole community of scientists and naturalists, amateur to experts that can help identify things as well. So which brings me to what's going on right now. Today is the first day of the Global City Nature Challenge. We've created a Canadian version of it because we're a bit latitudinally challenged here in the springtime, and some cities are still under snow. But there are over 700 cities taking part around the world these same 4 days, 36 cities in Canada, and thousands of people recording observations from now until the end of the day on Monday. So to take part, go to inaturalist.ca/projects. You can find the City Nature Challenge project, have a look at the map, or scroll down and you'll see the leaderboard, and this is basically the list of cities that are participating. If your city's participating, you basically just have to use iNaturalist and contribute. If you're not in one of these cities, there's a non-registered cities project. Once you click through on that, it brings you to that project page, and you'd have to click join for this one, and then your observations will automatically count. Basically, from now until the end of Monday, as I said, all you have to do is record observations. So if you use iNaturalist, remember, all you have to do is if you're in a participating city, observations are automatically added. And if you've joined the non-registered cities project, they're already added. So there's nothing more to do than record observations. And then for now until May 4th, for anybody that wants to help identify things, and you don't have to be an expert, if you know the difference between a robin and a blue jay, that's helpful. If you know the difference between a bird and a plant, that's also helpful, because bird experts will go through observations and just look at birds, right? So it helps to triage those observations for the experts to then be able to provide additional identification for. And I want to say, look at what's the impact, what can I do in the springtime? How many species are even can we record in Canada, in our city, in just 4 days? What's even around in April? As I said, some cities are under snow, or springtime is just getting going. And is this really of value? Well, I would like to show some stats from last year. Total numbers of observations, we had 123,000 observations in Canada. Remember how I noted that in iNaturalist Canada in total in the first year was only 30,000. We have a lot of species out that are still, a number of species at risk. And globally, we had 2.4 million observations and 83,000 people take part, all in just 4 days. This is a massive undertaking just across the globe for contributing data for conservation. And with that, I will wrap it up.
Perfect. Thank you so much, James. And I already see some questions coming in for James. If you have more questions, please put them in the Q&A chat there. Okay, next up we have Carly Zeter, who, if you were here with the introductions, have already met Carly as an associate professor at Concordia University. So Carly, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Merci beaucoup. So I have been fascinated by nature for a very long time. I was not part of a junior naturalist club, but I did spend a lot of time digging in my parents' garden as a kid, and took that passion for nature all the way to where I am now, where I am incredibly lucky. Je suis très très chanceuse that I get to spend so much of my time not only learning about nature, but teaching others. And it often surprises people when I explain that I'm an ecologist, I'm an environmental scientist, and that actually, like, one of my very favorite places to learn about nature is right here at home. I remember often, in graduate school, my friends and my colleagues would be going off to like Yellowstone National Park, and I would be so excited to just like sneak into people's backyards and see what was going on there and do a little science. And I still am. I love nothing more than doing science in your backyard. And so we do a lot of that in my lab, where I work with incredible young and not so young people to do things like study urban heat islands. We do all kinds of wacky, creative things like putting temperature sensors, on bicycles and in back alleys, and understanding how trees can reduce heat waves that have incredible health consequences. We use a lot of community science data, so that iNaturalist data that you're going to go out and collect this weekend for the City Nature Challenge, a lot of that ends up being used by, graduate students, professors, to better understand our neighborhoods, what's happening in those spaces. We do a lot of kind of traditional boots on the ground field work where we go out to understand how urban green spaces can support wildlife, can support birds, bees. All of these absolutely gorgeous bees were photographed right here in the city of Montreal by one of our student researchers. And every once in a while, I put on my citizen science, or my social scientist hat, and we talk with people. We talk with people across sectors, across disciplines. We do workshops to understand the challenges and the opportunities for getting more nature into cities. So Mark asked us all to come up with a problem and some solutions, and I thought a lot about what I wanted to talk about, having all of this experience, collecting data and working with cities and working with citizens and decision makers. And I love that Mark talked about this need to kind of create, restore, protect our green spaces, because we know that we need to do this. But why aren't we doing it? And I think a problem that comes up over and over in my work is that urban nature is viewed as an extra. It's viewed as like nice to have, but not essential. So la nature en milieu urbain est souvent considérée comme un élément agréable à voir plutôt qu'essentiel. And it's kind of like, once we've solved the big problems, then we can think about, some flowers and some trees. But what we miss with this viewpoint is that urban nature is such a big part of the solution to so many other problems, not only the climate and biodiversity crises, but problems with health, problems with social isolation. We need urban nature to solve those. And so what is the solution? I don't know if I'm going to get us all the way to a solution today. This one's hard, but I am going to talk about a couple things that I think are really important. And one, in kind of shifting urban nature from nice to essential, we really need to measure, monitor, and communicate the health and well-being benefits of urban biodiversity. So often, we put green infrastructure in, we plant trees, but we don't necessarily measure or monitor what's actually happening. So the kind of work that, Laura is doing, actually going out and seeing what happens when we change the way we manage our grasses, what happens when we implement these policies, is incredibly important, because it's really difficult to ask for more interventions, more time, more money, if we don't know if the first ones worked. And I talk a lot about trees because they're my favorite. But if we think about, some of the studies that have gone out and monitored and measured, I just pulled a couple of stats here where, every 100 trees planted in Oregon avoided one premature death. A third of all the urban heat-related deaths across Europe could be prevented by increasing neighborhood tree canopy. Like, these are real physical health and safety benefits that we get from this natural infrastructure. This is not just nice to have. So by measuring and communicating these, we can send the message to decision makers that this is really a need in our cities. It's not only our physical health, urban nature benefits our mental health. I love this this study that came out of Europe a few years ago, where it shows here, if we look at this graph, this is just showing a proportional increase either in the amount of money you make or the amount of birds you hear, bird species. And we can see that as you make more money, this blue line, people tend to like get a little bit more satisfied with their life as they make more income. Like money's great. You can do more fun things. You can support your family. But you know what makes people more satisfied with their life than money? Hearing a lot of species of birds. Which is just like incredible, right? And this isn't just more birds or louder birds. It's actually more variety, more species, more biodiversity of birds. And that people love birds. And that brings me to this point that like it's not simply enough that we go out and we're like, okay, we'll just add some more green and it doesn't matter what it is. It's not just more birds, louder birds, it's species of birds. It's not just more trees. We have to think about the types of nature we're introducing. That ecological knowledge is really key. And a photo is worth 1,000 words. And since I only have 10 minutes, I'm going to use this photo here to make this point. This is a beautiful street. I'd like to live on a street like this. Really nice tree cover, probably providing a lot of those really important health benefits. But a few years after this photo was taken, this is what that street looked like, because this was a street entirely of elm trees. And so when the emerald ash borer came in, we lost all of those benefits. And so as we're making decisions about adding nature to our cities, we really need that ecological knowledge, those measurements, that monitoring. We also need more than just ecological knowledge, because creating space for nature really requires working with other disciplines as well. Mark showed this great example of we need to create more green space, and we do, but where do we put it? In a city, everyone is fighting for the same space for their own, their own goals, their own projects. And I think there are a lot of solutions there. I like to pick on cars particularly, but if we look, for example, this another figure that's worth more than 1,000 words, I think. If we want to carry 50,000 people per hour, we can do that with a lot of cars, but we can also do that with, rapid transit, taking a fraction of the space, which suddenly frees up a lot more space for bringing that nature back into our cities. Similarly, thinking about the types of homes that we build, the places we live can free up a lot more space for that really essential nature in our cities. And that brings me to my final solution that I'm going to end with here, is that if we want to shift urban nature from like an added bonus to something that's seen as essential, we really need ecologists to have a seat at the table when these urban decisions are being made. If we want green, equitable cities, we need that interdisciplinary collaboration. And we hear a lot, if you're paying attention to goals and targets that we have around biodiversity, we hear a lot about mainstreaming biodiversity, this idea that we need to include biodiversity in everything we do. All sectors of society, all the policies we create need to think about biodiversity. And one of my colleagues here at Concordia, Emma Desplan, has a wonderful analogy that she often uses when she talks about mainstreaming, where she says it's like safety. No matter what kind of business, if you're a university, you are a restaurant, you are a government office, you need to think about safety. You need to think about the safety of your employees. And if you don't know how to do that, then you hire someone who knows something about safety to write you a safety plan. In that same way, all of these sectors of society that are making decisions that impact biodiversity need to think about that. And if you don't have the knowledge and expertise, you need to bring someone in who does. So until we get to Mark's world, where all our future decision makers have embraced biodiversity as children, I think we need to make sure that we're including those people with that training at the decision-making table so that we can make sure the decisions we're making are ecologically sound ones. And I am just about out of time, so I'm going to end there, but I would encourage you to throw questions in the chat. I'm very happy to talk more about any of this.
Parfait, merci, Carly. And our final speaker today is going to take us to the global climate change scale. We're going to be hearing from Tristan Tyrrell, who is a program officer with the Convention for, I have it here, Convention on Biological Diversity, Secretariat. Tristan, the floor.
Thanks very much, Mark. Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. So my name is Tristan Tyrrell. As Mark mentioned, I'm the program officer responsible for biodiversity, climate change, and dry and subhumid lands at the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity here in Montreal. The reason to link dry and subhumid lands with climate change as well as biodiversity is they are the three Rio conventions, the CBD, which I'll be talking a bit more about now, but also the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, which all three of them came out of the Rio Conference in 1992. There we go, that's working. So just very, very briefly, to take everyone out of the more applied, on the ground, sort of more personal connections, let's take it really zoom far out to the global level. So the UN Convention on Biological Diversity was, as I mentioned, was adopted in 1992 at the Rio Conference and came into force about a year later. And it has three main objectives. One is the conservation of biodiversity for its intrinsic value, recognizing the importance of nature, of biodiversity to us all, to our own health and well-being, but also for that of the planet. Secondly, the sustainable use of it, recognizing that we have a proportionally far more significant impact on biodiversity than any natural process, and we are certainly driving it towards its driving this current sixth extinction phase. And the final objective is the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. And that's because biodiversity, by its definition, is ecosystems, so the broader spaces, the species themselves, the animals and the plants, but then also that genetic diversity that actually makes up all of those at that very invisible, at least to the naked eye, level. And it's about capturing that complexity and the various scales that we need to be looking at this in order to try and ensure that we are leaving a healthier planet, or a healthy planet, for future generations. Under the convention, there are also two protocols which are a bit more specific. One on the use of living modified organisms, so biosafety, and the other is more specifically on that access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. Now we've been hearing about how various things have been affecting biodiversity, whether it's elm disease affecting those trees, or the impacts on soil health, etc. But these trends are certainly being seen at the global level, and these are just some examples of some recent studies that have shown this, including one that was published last year that says that 73% of species have been lost since the 1970s. And it's in this particular context that we are looking at, or well, not necessarily species, the abundance, but it's within this context, these continual negative trends for biodiversity, at the same time as we're seeing climate change really starting to have drastic impacts on both ourselves as well as those with which we share this planet. That means that we really need to be taking major action urgently, immediately, and effectively. And so just over 2 years ago here in Montreal, the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the convention, so COP15, adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which are global targets, goals and targets to try and address this biodiversity loss, with the mission of putting us on a path to recovery by 2030, so very much focusing on that restoration element, but then also with a long-term vision to 2050 that has us living in harmony with nature. And again, it's recognizing both the intrinsic, the nice to have, as Carly mentions, that it is nice to have it, but also that it fundamentally underpins ourselves, our societies, our economies, etc. And so the framework itself is based around trying to address the drivers and pressures on biodiversity that is leading to this loss, to the degradation or even extinction of species, and a way also of trying to ensure that the values, whether they are monetary but also culturally, spiritually, the services that ecosystems can provide to us are being sufficiently recognized and I want to say maximized, but maximized in a natural sense, not sort of forcibly enhanced, but are done through an appropriate measures and actions that allow us to ensure that ecosystem integrity and the health and well-being of biodiversity at all levels is being taken forward, and very much so for our benefit as humans on this planet. So like I mentioned, there are goals and targets. So there are 4 goals, which largely link to those objectives of the convention, as well as goal D, which is about the means of implementation, how we actually take that forward. So it's things like the monitoring, the indicators, and those sorts of things, the money, the financial resources needed to actually implement the actions that are required, communication and awareness raising, which of course is essential. And then also opportunities for collaboration, both within the sort of environmental sector, but also then thinking about how does it link through to other business sectors, other decision-making makers, whether they are at city levels or provincial level versus federal level, etc., however it may be around the world. And then we have these 23 action-orientated targets, which are to be met by 2030. And these focus on a number of different issues, including things on, excuse me, the engagement with the private sector and ensuring that companies recognize their risks, but also their responsibilities towards biodiversity loss and what they should be doing. But also other things about the respecting and promoting of the role of women in this, and various financial ones, including how much money is supposed to be provided to help ensure the implementation of the framework. Some of the targets link specifically to climate change. Target 8 is directly related to climate change, about minimizing the impacts that climate change have on biodiversity. But then there are also others about looking at how we can use biodiversity to help us both mitigate climate change itself, but also to reduce the impacts of climate change on ourselves, whether it's through adaptation or even just reducing the risk of disasters from happening. Another one is also then Target 12, which speaks specifically to green and blue spaces in urban areas, and the need for that subnational local level action as well. Like has been mentioned, most of us live in cities these days, and so urban centers. Urban centers themselves are where most of us kind of focus our attention. They're where we place ourselves, but it's important to recognize that there are impacts both within cities themselves, but also outside where we get our resources from. Where does our water come from that's flowing in our pipes, the food, etc., that we have on our plates? Where is all that coming from? Some of the other related targets 1, 2, and 3 are more the sort of spatial ones. So 1 on spatial planning, 2 is on restoration, 3 is on things like protected areas, and other similar sort of forms of area management. Target 14 is about decision making at all the various levels, and 21 is on the different forms of knowledge. So whether it's Western science, but also recognizing traditional knowledge and the cultures and practices of Indigenous peoples, and how they can help to both support the actions required to address climate change and biodiversity loss, but also likewise that we need to respect those in our various decisions that are being taken. There's some cross-cutting considerations that link right across all of those targets, and a number of these I've mentioned already, but I think they also touch very much so in terms of what others have said already today about the need for that knowledge to be brought in and to be respected, the value systems, recognizing that it's not just about monetary return, but also different forms of value that people place on it. Biodiversity and health. The COP15 was just at the end of the pandemic, so it was very much at the center of people's minds at the time. But COP16, which happened just a few months ago, also adopted a global action plan on biodiversity and health, very much taking those connections forward. And climate change is obviously a running theme throughout that. A couple of others about gender equality, but also intergenerational equity, and thinking about what are we leaving for the next generation, but also how do we bring them on board in some of both the decision-making processes, but also in terms of implementation and what they need to be doing. In like I mentioned, COP16 happened just a few months ago, and there was
we'll have to wrap it up. We're just out of time now.
Okay.
Can you 30 seconds?
Sure. Okay. So anyway, COP16 had a strong decision on the need for collaboration and synergy when addressing this at all levels, and that also includes urban managers, decision makers, etc., urban planners. As Carly mentioned, the need for participation from all in some of those decision making, recognizing that the boundaries are not necessarily set in stone as such. There are links between urban and rural areas, etc., and also things that happen overseas. And yeah, in terms of the solution then that I was trying to get to, was that we need for this kind of understanding and engagement at all levels in order to ensure that we are actually taking this forward. There have been decisions taken at global level recognizing this problem. We're obviously seeing impacts at the local level, but there is a missing middle in terms of how we translate all of these concerns into concrete, long-term sustainable actions that will turn things around. The one final thing, just to bring this together, I think, as James said, in terms of the iNaturalist and that sort of collective action around the world, one of the things is to recognize that whether we as individuals or as communities or whatever are not working on our own. And so one of the things is the International Day for Biodiversity, which is on the 22nd of May. There's a link there. And it's about showing how we are all working towards similar goals. We just need to bring them all together. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Merci beaucoup, Tristan. And now is the time for putting your questions in the Q&A. They've already been accumulating, which is fantastic. I'm going to call on each of the speakers as I put questions into the chat for them, and I'm going to ask you to read out those questions if you could, for everyone to hear in case they didn't hear them in the Q&A. And so the first question was for Laura. Laura, could you read the question in French and English, please?
Yes, this question. Existe-t-il des indicateurs pour mesurer la santé de la biodiversité des sols? Is there some indicator to measure soil biodiversity health? Je vais répondre en français vu que la question a été donnée en français. Je crois que, dans le fond, c'est une très bonne question. La biodiversité des sols, c'est quelque chose qui est très pointu à identifier. Je ne pense pas qu'il y en a beaucoup sur iNaturalist parce que ça demande quand même c'est très difficile à identifier. Ça prend des heures et des heures au microscope. Et donc, c'est vrai que de mesurer tous ces organismes-là à chaque fois qu'on va sur le terrain pour savoir si nos sols sont en santé, ce n'est pas quelque chose qui est faisable, pratique, dans le temps. Alors, il faut trouver des indicateurs qui nous permettent de représenter un ensemble, l'ensemble de la biodiversité. Puis, ce qu'on a observé jusqu'à maintenant, dans le contexte de la gestion des pelouses, on remarque que les araignées répondent très bien. Là, dès que tu arrêtes de tondre les pelouses, les araignées vont très vite réagir. Et pourquoi pas choisir des araignées, par exemple, qui sont faciles à identifier, qui sont grosses comme les araignées loups. Donc, c'est ça, c'est de trouver certains groupes de biodiversité qui nous permettent de mieux représenter la grosse biodiversité. Donc, je dirais, si vous avez beaucoup d'araignées dans votre cour, dans votre pelouse, c'est bon signe. Vous pouvez regarder les plus petites choses, mais généralement, c'est un bon indicateur pour le reste. Voilà.
Voila, indeed. Merci. So the second question was for James Paget. James, can you read out the question and do your best to answer it?
Oh, great, thanks. The question was written in both French and English. That's excellent. So I'll just summarize it in French. Essentially, dans l'été passé qu'à Montréal, ces personnes avaient été obligées de polliniser les fleurs de courgettes à main parce qu'il y avait un manque de pollinisateurs. Puis pourquoi c'était un problème l'année dernière, puis pas dans 2023. So the question about whether the need to hand pollinate some of their zucchini flowers because there weren't as many pollinators in 2020 and this past summer versus 2023. There could be a lot of answers or a lot of reasons for that. It may actually just be natural cycles of insect, abundance and decline. That's could be completely a natural cycle. It could also be a factor of pesticide use or herbicide use in urban areas. Maybe a neighbor, maybe an area has started using pesticides, and it speaks to the need for natural solutions and natural species around for our pollinators to make use of to help insect populations. So, the species that are pollinating the zucchini flowers are also relying on other plants for nectar sources and pollen sources. So to have a variety of species around would encourage the abundance of pollinating insects. So it's hard really to pinpoint it to one thing. And I would just encourage maybe keep an eye out again this year. Have a look on iNaturalist to see if there's a bunch of species pollinator species being recorded this year compared to last year. And hopefully there's a bounce back.
Great advice. Thanks, James. Carly, the third question was for you. Can you read the question for everyone?
Okay, yes, let me just find it in the chat. Okay, so as you showed, the emerald ash borer had an effect on ecology. How many more examples are illustrated to frame policy to protect biodiversity? I think there are a lot of examples that we could draw on for how to protect biodiversity. I mean, I just thinking about trees and pests because they're such a visual one. If we look back through, the past number of decades, there's not only emerald ash borer. We've seen this with chestnut blight. We see it now with Dutch elm disease in a lot of our prairie cities. I think in a lot of cases where we rely too heavily on, one species in our systems, we lose that resilience. We lose that kind of security. And we also, it's not just this risk of something being lost. When we lack biodiversity, we're also only getting a subset of the benefits we could get. And so something that people ask me all the time when they hear I study urban trees, they say, oh, great, what's the best tree? Which tree should I plant? And I refuse to answer that question because the best tree for what and for who, right? If you want something that's going to be beautiful and to feed the birds, maybe you want a nice serviceberry or Saskatoon. If you want a big tall shade tree, you want something else. And so the more biodiversity, the more variety we can get, the more likely we are to have benefits for multiple different people. There are some specific, I know you asked about policy, there are some specific examples of guidelines, things like the 330-300 guideline that everyone should see 3 trees from their home, have 30% canopy cover in their neighborhood and live 300 meters from a green space. Or, there's other guidelines around Toronto has a bylaw that a certain proportion of types of roofs has to be green roof for larger buildings. So I do think we're seeing a lot more policies that are coming on board to protect biodiversity. And the examples are out there. We just have to, again, ask ecologists, ask people who work in this field. Everyone's going to have their favorite example of why we need biodiversity. Mark, you're on mute.
Thank you for reminding me. Thank you so much, Carly. So Tristan, there was a few questions for you, and I've put one in the chat. If you could read that out and tell us about it.
Thanks, Mark. So the question in English is COP16 focused on collaboration and synergy. Can underdeveloped countries also be included as they account for a significant proportion of global greenery? En français, le COP16, la collaboration et synergie étaient importants au COP16. Et est-ce que les pays sous-développés peuvent être inclus à cause de la significance globale sur la biodiversité? So I hope, Laura, you can correct me if that was a horrendous attempt at translation. But Yes, absolutely. So there is very much a focus within the CBD process on how to support those countries that are still in development and how they can meet their obligations as such, given that they have agreed to global goals like these, the GBF, and they are expected, as all countries are, to develop ambitious plans in order to achieve those both goals and targets, but also certainly the plans to achieve those targets. And so there's a lot of discussion around capacity building, about resource mobilization, the financial aspects, as well as just a general understanding of the different perspectives on biodiversity, and especially when it comes to biodiversity and climate change. There's a lot of discussions about how obligations for reducing emissions also comes into some of these discussions about protecting, conserving, sustainably managing, restoring nature. If we continue to exacerbate these drivers for biodiversity loss, all these wonderful actions aren't going to have much of an impact in the longer term if we're not actually addressing climate change, as well as some of the other drivers, including overconsumption, invasive species, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, very, very important for the convention, as highlighted at COP16. Thanks.
Thank you, Tristan. The next question was directed at me, and Colleen said, I love the junior naturalist program. Could programs like that be added to everyday school curriculum for junior kindergarten to grade 8 to broaden the participation? I absolutely think that's possible. There's a few different ways that can be done. So you may have heard that there's actually outdoor schools, that pretty much all of the schooling happening outside, and so that is naturally incorporated into their learning and the programs there. There's also these programs where you can go to outdoor education centers in many regions, but often that's kind of one and done, and you'll get maybe one a year or one a term if you're really lucky. So I think it becomes, I love this idea where you can actually incorporate some of this learning into the classroom on a regular basis. And for example, my wife is an early childhood educator in kindergarten classrooms, and for a while, once a week on Fridays, they would always go do a nature walk. And I think that's something that you could do routinely if you put it on the schedule, teaching kids how to learn and listen from nature and let them appreciate nature. And I think it starts with the teachers setting that example, and then the children will follow from that. I think children are innately interested in nature, and they're often taught to fear it. And so I think if we don't teach that fear into them, I think they will be naturally curious and naturally value what they see, and then be able to take this forward as they get older. And so please reach out if you want to see more about that program and how elements of it could be implemented into your classroom. We're still taking questions here. I think we're going to 3:15. So I think we've got a couple more minutes. I'm going to push one to Carly right now, and I'm going to read it out for you, Carly. Carly, do you know how many cities in Quebec have adopted ecological urban practices? I live in Pontclair, where some green areas are no longer mowed.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have like a specific number for you to say, there are 17 cities, but I do know that there are several examples through Quebec. For example, the gestion différenciée, or there's never a good English translation for this, differentiated mowing, meadowscaping.
Meadowscaping is cute.
But
yeah.
that Laura talked about happens in many municipalities around Montreal and different boroughs. So that is catching on. There are also a number of private tree bylaws. So most boroughs and municipalities in the island of Montreal, but I believe in other parts of Quebec as well, have bylaws where you need a permit to remove a tree from your land. This is really important because more than 50% of our urban forest grows on private land. So that has big impacts for climate resilient cities. There is actually one Quebec town, Saint-Amable, that recently implemented a fine to homeowners who had a treeless yard, which I thought was kind of an interesting and creative approach to take. I haven't read very much about it. I just, a few people sent me the article. And so certainly there is some momentum, but there's a lot of room for growth and ecologically friendly practices. There are still a lot of cities in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada that have bylaws in place, for example, that prevent you from naturalizing your yard. A lot of people have successfully fought back against those, but it's often, you know, the people that fight back and convince the cities to become more ecologically friendly rather than municipalities necessarily taking the initiative. And so I would like to see more municipalities taking initiative to put these in place and give examples to residents rather than us having to push them. I don't know, Laura, if you have anything to add in terms of Quebec City.
But yeah, maybe just because I'm working on this too. Like
Yeah.
I just recently had a meeting with Montreal practitioners, and like so far, like most of the arrondissement, like the borough, do perform meadowscaping, and in each borough, we're talking about maybe 20 to 30 hectares, like that are unmown. And just to remind you that lawns represent 20% of Montreal, like, and cities. It can represent the total surface of a city, like 20%. So it's huge. Like, so if you uncut, like, you know, 30% of this 20%, it's still a big surface. And also there's a lot of people contacting us because they are interested. There's a lot of initiative by the municipalities to reduce the height, to increase the height allowed in front of the house and things like that, because now there's regulation. Let's say you cannot have high grass because of risk of fire or things like that, but now they're asking us data to support their decision, because this is the thing.
Yeah.
They need data to back, like, you know, their decision and their new policies, because otherwise it's contested. So it's why I see more and more momentum right now, because we're contacted a lot right now. So just want to say that it's optimistic thing.
Yeah. And I think if you like something your city is doing, call and tell them, because you know someone is calling them to say, oh, that's messy, I don't like it. So they need to hear the positive side as well.
For sure.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. That's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for bringing their expertise and enthusiasm and sharing that so openly with everyone. And I'd especially like to thank all of those people that signed on and listened and participated and asked questions. You know, it really is about you and all of us working together on these solutions. And so thank you for being part of that. And we look forward to seeing what you come up with, and maybe we'll hear from some of you in the days to come.
All right. Merci beaucoup à tous les participants et pour vos excellentes questions. Et maintenant, allez-y et participez au défi de la nature en ville. Go out there and participate in the City Nature Challenge. Thank you all.
Merci, au revoir.
Au revoir.